Is Jesus really the word of the Lord in the Old Testament? Some Trinitarians propose that the word of the Lord being referenced in places like Genesis 15:1 is actually a separate being from God himself. And many propose that it's Jesus. Let's read Genesis 15:1. In the ESV it says, "After these things the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." So people say that word of the Lord there, the word of Yahweh, it's Yahweh in the Hebrew, is a separate being from Yahweh. That's what Trinitarians are arguing. Let's look at why that's not the case. The first reason is that throughout the entire Old Testament, the word of Yahweh or the word of the Lord never once speaks to Yahweh. So if the word of the Lord was a separate being, aka Jesus, you'd expect that maybe one time it would speak to Yahweh. But out of the 242 occurrences of this term, not one time does that happen. Secondly, the word of Yahweh is not a separate being from Yahweh any more than the word of Moses is a separate being from Moses. It's simply a Semitic way of saying someone said something. So if I said Johnny said something, you could say the word of Johnny was this. It's simply how they speak. Exodus 8:13 says, "So Yahweh did according to the word of Moses, and the frogs died out from the houses, from the courts, and from the fields." So are we to conclude that there's a separate being from Moses that's somehow related to Moses, but God's listening to that person, not listening to Moses? No, clearly in the context, it's what Moses said that God is listening to. So the word of Moses is not a separate being from Moses. This idiom can also be seen in Numbers 3:51, which reads, "And Moses gave the redemption money to Aaron and to his sons, according to the word of Yahweh, as Yahweh commanded Moses." Here it can be clearly seen that according to the word of Yahweh, that phrase is simply an idiomatic way of saying what Yahweh commanded or as Yahweh commanded. So if you're doing something according to the word of Yahweh, then you're doing it as Yahweh commanded. This understanding is further solidified in the context, because earlier in the context, in Numbers 3:44 and 48, it says, "Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, you are to give the money to Aaron and his sons." So in the context, who is giving this command to Moses? Yahweh. The word of Yahweh, a separate being, never gives a command to Moses. It's just Yahweh that gives a command to Moses. But yet the text speaks of it as if the word of Yahweh was given to Moses. So clearly we see that it's just an expression to denote what Yahweh said. He doesn't intend to mean there's another being actually giving this command to Moses. Now there are a few times where the word of the Lord is used and God or Yahweh is not directly speaking. Rather, he's speaking through an intermediary or through a prophet, something like that. So for example, in Joshua 8:8, Joshua is the one who actually is communicating the word of the Lord. It reads, "You are to do according to the word of Yahweh. See, I have commanded you." So Joshua is the one speaking, yet he's speaking the word of Yahweh. So basically he's just relaying Yahweh's words. All of this to say, the word of the Lord is not a separate person, but a separate person can speak the word of the Lord. Let me repeat that again. The word of the Lord is not a separate person, but a separate person can speak the word of the Lord. Thirdly, some Trinitarians propose that the word of the Lord really is a separate being from Yahweh in Genesis 15:1 because it says the word of the Lord came to Abram. The simple solution to this is that the word of blank came to blank is simply a personification, and it happens quite a few times in the Old Testament. In 1 Samuel 4:1, it says, "And the word of Samuel came to all Israel." Yet in the context in 1 Samuel 3, it had just ended by saying that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. So he was consistently speaking God's message to Israel. So when we get to 1 Samuel 4:1 and it says the word of Samuel came to Israel, it would be a really creative interpretation to believe that literally a separate being from Samuel, somehow related to Samuel, came to Israel. No, rather this is clear personification. It just means that Samuel spoke to Israel. That's all it means. It's not the separate being from Samuel that's somehow physically coming to Israel. No, the word of Samuel is just what Samuel spoke. So, therefore, in Genesis 15:1, when it says that the word of the Lord came to Abram, this by no means implies that there's a separate being coming to Abram. In fact, later in the passage, it says that Yahweh brought him outside and said, "Look now toward the heavens." So in the context, Yahweh is identified as the one who's speaking to Abram in this vision, not a separate being. So for all these reasons, it's pretty clear the word of the Lord is not a separate being from God himself. It's simply what God said. Lastly, remember that no New Testament author ever tries to make this claim. They never once try to make the claim that Jesus is the word of the Lord in the Old Testament. That would have been a very easy claim to make. They never do it. So this is a speculative argument by Trinitarians at best. But I think when you take into account the way Hebrew people spoke in that culture, it's pretty clear that the word of the Lord is simply what the Lord said. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider donating in the link below. And as always, please like and subscribe to help more people see content like this.